As the prophet Jeremiah may have said to the king of Judah as the Babylonians were closing in, "I'm not here to make you feel better." I hope I don't make you feel worse, but what I would like to do is suggest a template, a framework for thinking about the problems of which we're all aware, which have become so prominent in our public life during this presidential election cycle. I want to begin with the idea batted around in various idiotic soundbite ways in recent months of American exceptionalism. Some people are for it. Some people are against it. 44th President of the United States doesn't seem to know what to make of it. I want to begin with the obvious truth in that phrase, American exceptionalism. And to see what's obvious about it, all you have to do is reflect for 2 minutes on the surnames of the people you've met here this evening. And you understand what's exceptional about our country. It's not a country rooted in an idea of soil or blood or ethnicity. It's a country of which anyone can be a part if they subscribe to and own and live by certain ideas. We're a proposition country. And that proposition that is America, it seems to me, is based on 4 truths that I want to speak about briefly tonight, and then look at as a template for examining the health of our political culture. The first truth in the American proposition, the first truth on which the founders and framers began this experiment in democratic republicanism, is the truth that God is sovereign over nations as well as individuals. Or, if you prefer to put that in more theologically neutral terminology, the American proposition includes the truth that there are moral truths built into the world and built into us, that we can know them by reason, and that those moral truths stand in judgment on our democratic experiment. When we say in the Pledge of Allegiance, "One nation under God," what we're saying, whether we're theists or not, is one nation under judgment. We're holding ourselves to a higher standard. The second of those truths that make up the proposition that is American democracy is that there is in the people, not just in the aristocracy, not just in elected officials, not just in a king, which we disposed of, there is in the people an inherent sense of justice, which means that the people ought to be able to give consent through participation to the way they are governed, and that participation is protected by legally affirmed civil and political rights. Consent, justice, participation, rights. The third truth in the proposition that makes America America is that society, or what we now tend to call civil society, is prior to the state, and the state exists to serve society, not the other way around. State exists to serve society, not society to serve the state. And the fourth part of this complex proposition is the conviction that is found in both biblical religion and classical political theory that only a virtuous people can be free. Only a virtuous people can be truly free. I've been reading in the past few weeks a very interesting new biography of John Quincy Adams. Some of you may have seen it reviewed in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago. The author begins, as a biographer, I'm very susceptible to how authors begin biographies. He begins by saying, John Quincy Adams did not seek the approval of men and largely succeeded. I mean, he was a cranky old thing. But it was the crankiness of a man determined to live by what he understood to be moral truths and to live a virtuous life. And if that put him in conflict with others, then so be it. And it was not just Adams, John Quincy Adams, who had this view. The notion that virtue was essential to the Republic was epidemic, in the best sense of the term, throughout the founding. It's part of the heritage of our Puritan ancestors who wanted to build what Ronald Reagan famously referred to as that city on a hill. Well, if those are the four mega ideas, and those are a template by which we can measure and assess the present situation, then how are we doing? And the answer has to be, we're not doing too well. And the terms in which we're not doing too well, I think, help explain some of the distress that many people have been feeling. Take that first idea that God is sovereign over nations and individuals, and that there is a universal moral law that we can know by reason. The problem here is not so much the famous new atheists, Dawkins and company. Their 15 minutes of fame has run out. The problem is something worse. What my colleague at the journal First Things, David Bentley Hart, has called metaphysical boredom, or what I would call spiritual boredom, a kind of soured nihilism about the very mystery and adventure of life itself, that manifests itself in many ways, one of which is a radical individualism in which the human person is reduced to a twitching bundle of desires, and the whole role of governance is to satisfy those desires, no matter what they may be. That sounds like Mr. Justice Kennedy to you. That's because that's exactly what he thinks. This spiritual boredom, this metaphysical boredom, manifests itself in the claim that moral truths we can know by reason, such as the truth that marriage is about men and women, constitute what the Washington Post has called on many occasions irrational bigotry, and that the very idea of a natural moral law is prejudice. Now, this would have come as news to Jefferson, who grounded the Declaration on self-evident moral truths. Would have come as news to Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address. Would have come as news more recently to Martin Luther King, whose whole letter from Birmingham jail was about the power of natural moral law to inform public life. So the notion of a nation under judgment has been reduced or traduced from judgment against a horizon of noble aspiration, truths we can know by reason, or for those of us who are religious believers, by revelation, to this notion of the twitching bundle of desires, all of which are equal, and all of which the state has to facilitate. How about the second idea in the proposition that there's an inherent sense of justice in the people, who therefore have a right to participate in governance, to offer consent to proposals for how they are governed, and that all of that is protected by civil and political rights legally embodied. That has taken a huge beating in our country in recent decades, primarily but not exclusively through what my colleagues and I in the journal First Things called almost 20 years ago, the judicial usurpation of politics, the theft of the democratic process by the federal judiciary, and particularly the Supreme Court of the United States, of which the two most outrageous examples in living memory are, of course, Roe versus Wade in 1973, when the Supreme Court simply abolished the abortion law of all 50 states in the District of Columbia, and then last year, Obergefell, when the Supreme Court abolished the marriage law of 43 states, I believe it was, both of which even liberal or progressive constitutional scholars recognize were exercises in which Potter Stewart called in 1973 raw judicial power. This is eroding our democracy in a very, very serious way. It's our version of what was going on in Europe, what is going on in Europe with these transnational judicial bodies imposing their views on national legislatures and indeed national courts. But in addition, I would say that this consent participation idea in the American proposition is being deeply eroded by the vulgarization of our politics in the media and online. Many of you, I'm sure, read an op-ed piece a couple of weeks ago by my friend Joe Epstein, former editor of the American Scholar, probably the greatest essayist in America today, and one of the three funniest people I've ever met in my life. And it had a picture of the 5 last standing presidential candidates, and the headline was, "Can't we do better than this?" And Joe's explanation of why we can't is that no sensible person would want to put their family or themselves through the gauntlet that our media has established as a kind of pre-primary primary. And we all know examples of people who have said no because of that. I mean, the most prominent, obviously, would be Mitch Daniels, the former governor of Indiana. But this vulgarization has gotten particularly worse this time. It's not just one candidate's fault. The rest have played along in the game. This is deeply problematic because it impedes that serious exchange among serious citizens that's the lifeblood of democracy. What about the third idea, that society is prior to the state and the state exists to serve society, not vice versa? Well, that's taken a beating too, particularly from the present administration, which seems determined to whittle down the size of civil society as narrowly as possible by turning the institutions of civil society into delivery systems for government programs. The most outrageous example of this, of course, certainly in my view, is the bullying of these sweet Little Sisters of the Poor by the Department of Health and Human Services in an effort to compel them to do something they believe is religiously and morally impossible for them to do, which is now being decided by the Supreme Court. That in itself, that effort by HHS in itself, is part of a broader problem of the present administration, which seems to understand religious freedom as simply the right to worship. In fact, if you looked through the speeches of both Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Secretary of State John Kerry, you will not find the term right of religious freedom. You will find, beginning with Secretary Clinton's speech at Georgetown, a formerly Catholic university in this city, in December of 2009, you will find the phrase freedom to worship, which is certainly a component part of religious freedom, but the language of religious freedom in full and the idea of religious freedom in full has simply been evacuated by this administration in its foreign policy and in its approach to domestic affairs. What's at stake here involves everybody. It's not just Catholics with the Little Sisters of the Poor. It wasn't just Lutherans in the Hosanna Tabor case. Can a Lutheran school hire teachers according to its understanding of who should teach in a Lutheran school? What's at stake here is the fundamental question of whether the institutions of civil society are going to be allowed to be themselves in our country, whether they're religious or secular, familial. Are they going to be permitted by this increasing Leviathan state, this fourth branch of government, the administrative state, to be themselves? If they aren't, then we may be one half generation away from serious trouble. Finally, the question of only how, the idea that only a virtuous people can be free. Well, there are so many problems on this front that I can only highlight some of the most dramatic. In most of American higher education today, particularly at prestigious institutions, classical political theory has been replaced by a notion of political science that is essentially a subset of the discipline of statistics. So there's no real thought about political ideas. Democracy is reduced, as often happens in some conservative circles when talking about markets, to a matter of mechanics. You just get the machinery right, stick the ignition key in, turn it over, and everything runs hunky-dory. Well, we know it doesn't, because we know it isn't running well right now. And one of the reasons it's not running well right now, particularly on the Democratic side of this, is the virtue deficit in American democracy, in which all serious debate over that ethical core of every great public policy issue is impeded or simply blocked by the use of trumping words, that's a lower T, trumping words, trump card words like choice or fair, which is the true F word in American public life today. Used to be something that only 3-year-olds said, right? That's not fair, Daddy. Okay, it's now the Trump word in our public life. The deterioration of the notion of tolerance, which means to, from its Latin root, to bear with others, to explore difference within a bond of civility, tolerance has become intolerance. Most depressingly manifest on our college and university campuses today, including those college and university campuses at which some parents, for some incomprehensible reason to me, are continuing to pay over $250,000 for a frankly lousy education in a bad moral environment in which these kids are not being taught the arts of tolerance and engagement with others. They're being taught to be little authoritarians. This is a very serious problem. And I would suggest that the virtue idea is also being eroded by the new tribalism in American public life. Now, there's always been this going on. You read novels of ethnic politics in the 1920s and 30s. There was all sorts of tribalism there of various sorts. But this has a kind of weird edge to it. The old tribalism was a way of organizing votes. The new tribalism is a way of imposing a regime of moral relativism on the entire society. The new tribalism, whether it's ethnic tribalism or racial tribalism or gender tribalism, is imposing a kind of dictatorship of relativism on the rest of us. And we had a perfect example of this here in my state, the People's Republic of Maryland, just this week. A Senate candidate, Congresswoman from Prince George's County, based her entire campaign on the fact that she was an African-American single mother, and that tribe needed to be represented in the Senate. Well, the Senate certainly needs to be attended to those problems. Thank God she didn't abort the child. Being a single mother is a tough job. None of that has anything to do with her qualifications for office. She loses. She gives a bitter speech that night. When are my Democratic friends going to catch up with the need to diversify? The next morning, the Washington Post says, well, it's perhaps a slightly unfortunate speech, but she's really right, failing to notice that we Republicans in Maryland had just nominated a woman for the Senate, meaning that some tribes are more equal than other tribes, to vary George Orwell here. This is really bad stuff. That sense of solidarity that we saw powerfully manifested in this country on 9/11, when people who simply had no idea who they were trying to rescue felt an obligation that was not abstract, it was very concrete, and it was very much a fellow feeling among Americans. They had an obligation to try to help. That has been so deeply eroded in the past 15 years, particularly in our high culture, which panders to this tribalism incessantly, or the low culture of television, which some of us were talking about earlier tonight. This is part of the problem, too. So, if we're a proposition country, and the proposition has certain component parts that are, great ideas, and the truths, not just ideas, truths. And those truths are not being received and owned and held and actualized sufficiently in our country, then we've got a proposition deficit. And my suggestion tonight is that a lot of the distress we're experiencing right now reflects that. There are all sorts of other reasons for it, global, structural, economic reasons, generally fed up with everything reasons, revolt against political correctness, et cetera, et cetera. But we've been living off the, if you will, propositional capital of this country for a long time. We were talking about young people and do they understand what they've been given. They've been given an account that's been spent down, and they don't understand that because they think this kind of thing just keeps on going. One of the other striking things, and I'll close on this because I did tell you I wasn't here to make you feel better. one of the striking things about this John Quincy Adams biography is how these founders and framers, who we esteem, were so painfully aware of the fragility of what they were doing. At the time of the Missouri Compromise, at the time of the War of 1812. I mean, these people who had put this together were very concerned that it might fly apart. American democracy is an experiment. There's no guarantee that the experiment will be a success indefinitely. It's been the greatest political success in the history of the world, in my view, for over 200 years now, not without difficult moments and not without struggle. But we're in a very, very difficult moment now. And the answer to all of that, it seems to me, can only be in moral and cultural renewal. That's the only thing that's going to produce political renewal. And that moral and cultural renewal begins with each of us. Begins with our owning the truths of the proposition, begins with our sharing those truths with those we touch as fellow citizens, as family members, as neighbors, as business associates. It's up to us to hand over to the generation that's one generation away an account, a moral, cultural account that's been a bit more topped up than it is now. Because right now, it's getting pretty low, and I think that explains some of our distress today. Thanks very much.